Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much. So the kind of just rough agenda of what we're going to try and do today, we're going to do the least interesting thing first, which is I'm just going to tell you about 5 or 7 minutes about me and how I got here and why I have any authority to speak to you all today. We're going to spend most of our time kind of talking about what I think is a really interesting and emerging topic on building decarb, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for kind of Q&A, both either about this topic or frankly anything energy related, because I love talking about this stuff. And so thank you so much for that very kind introduction. You made me sound way cooler than I actually am. My name is Michael Colvin. Work at Environmental Defense Fund. I'll talk a little bit about EDF in a second. One of the opening things that I guess I'd like to just sort of start with is when I think about energy policy and energy topics in this state, I really like to think about sort of 3 central pillars. I like to think about making certain that all Californians have access, that's kind of the buzzword, access to affordable, clean, and safe energy. And you need all 3 of those things. And if you don't have one of them, then the other 2 are sort of meaningless. I always like to point out to folks that about 1/3 of Californians are low income and qualify for low income assistance programs, meaning they can't afford their energy bill. And so as we talk about how we're going to transform our economy and all do these great whiz-bang things, which are really important and vital, we have to make certain that costs are sort of forefront in the mind, because electricity and energy are vital inputs to human life. You can't not have them. As recently witnessed throughout most of Northern California a couple of weeks ago with those public safety power shutoffs. We can talk about this later if y'all want. Anyway, so I'm getting more into the substantive stuff. I'm supposed to be talking about myself right now, sorry. As Austin said, I lead up all of our California energy advocacy at Environmental Defense Fund. Before that, I spent 10 years working for the state of California at an organization called the California Public Utilities Commission. The CPUC itself is a 100-year-old agency, and it is focused on regulating the state's investor-owned or privately owned utilities. While I was at the PUC, because it was a decade, I got to do a lot of really cool things, working on topics from cogeneration and qualifying facilities and trying to really figure out how do we make those work, energy efficiency. I literally got to spend $1 billion, in an afternoon, kind of fun. I did all the original modeling on something called the California Solar Initiative, and I did all the budgeting for that and tried to figure out how those waterfalls of steps and incentives would work. And doing like Excel, solar models, and like really trying to like figure out how to optimize spend. I did a lot of stuff on demand response, on procurement, pretty much a whole host of issues, low-income issues, which is something I'm passionate about. And what's really interesting and I think great working in that type of a role is you get to both sort of think about what's coming up next and draw upon the stuff that we've done before to help build on what's next. As Austin mentioned, I have a master's in public policy, and a lot of public policy is really thinking about how do you get smart people in a room together with a lot of different perspectives and try and do a little bit better from what you have done before. And decisions are made by those who show up. And so part of my job at EDF is to be somebody who is showing up at the right places and really trying to advocate for what I think makes the most sense. So the last thing that I will say before we get into the heart of this talk, just sort of about me and kind of how I view a lot of these energy topics, is you do not need to be a subject matter expert in any one particular field in order to have an important perspective. You need to have in the energy space people who are full-on engineers, people who are full-on accountants. You need people who are lawyers. You need people who are social advocates. You need environmental folks. I think they are really important. You need all sorts of perspectives because, as I sort of mentioned a minute ago, energy is a fundamental input into our lives and into our economy. You can't not have it. If the power goes down in the heat of the summer, people could die from heat exposure. If you don't have enough heating in the winter, people could die from cold. You know, these are just basic inputs. Forget about the fact that, you know, I need to charge my iPhone every day also, you know, because I'm addicted to my email. So there are just lots of these things that are out there. The California legislature, by the way, has declared electricity to be a basic human right. This is not just Michael making this as fuss and these claims. So with that, I'm going to probably transition a little bit more into the heart of our talk. So within Environmental Defense Fund, the California program focuses on three sort of core areas. The first is, how do we get carbon out of our buildings? And that's all building stock. It's not just our homes, and but it's our businesses, it's our manufacturing, it's our industry buildings. We also focus on how do we get carbon or electrify our big heavy trucks and our big heavy buses, so medium heavy duty vehicles. And then the third pillar is sort of what I would call smart rules to help make those first two happen. You know, really going after the utility business model and trying to figure out ways so that we can get the utilities who are the providers of these vital inputs to be lining up with the objectives that we think make the most sense. And so that can be anything from what are the rules around procurement, what are the rules about how they make money, what are the rules on their rate designs, you know, all sorts of stuff, but it's sort of those three categories. So the one that I wanted to kind of start off with is talking about decarbonizing our buildings. So getting into this a little bit about Environmental Defense Fund, we are a 501c3. We are global. We operate in about 28 countries. We have over 700 staff, 70 of which are here in California. But I have people who work on California topics that are from all over the world. And so we are very diffused and dispersed. That's the word I'm looking for, organization. We have scientists, we have economists, we have technical expertise, we have policy wonks like me, we have attorneys. You know, sometimes we have to say we go out and see the bastards. You know, it is all, thank you for the big laugh. You know, there's a lot of integrity behind what we do, and we are very much driven by data, we are driven by science, and we're driven by economic analysis. And what I think is part of the EDF special sauce, one of the reasons why I really wanted to work for them, is that it's much more focused on market opportunities and on the business relationships. And so a lot of what I do is not only the policy advocacy within the actual government organizations, you know, at the legislature, at the regulatory bodies, but it's also trying to get the business opportunities to help them see, all right, here's what's going policy-wise, and how does that line up with your business case? What are the partnerships that we need you to do to help get to the environmental outcomes that we're looking for? So the need to decarbonize. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one, but just in case, we are at a point of a climate crisis, we need to decarbonize our economy. But luckily, we're on a pathway to do that. I think most people in the room are probably aware last year, the California legislature adopted Senate Bill 100, which is a move to decarbonize the entire electric grid by 2045. 60% of that will be through the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and the other 40% will be other carbon neutral resources. What does that mean, and how does that look? You know, we think we know, we think we have a pathway, but it still allows for some flexibility to let technology improve. And so knowing that the electric grid itself is going to be carbon neutral, how can we use that to our best advantage to line up with decarbonizing the rest of our economy? And so California's buildings itself accounts for one of the largest end uses of carbon that are left out there. Cars are the big one, and I could do a whole nother one of these talks on decarbonizing heavy duty transportation. But the buildings one to me is actually, I think, a really interesting nut to crack, because what does it mean to decarbonize a building? You know, we're here at the heart of the Energy Efficiency Institute, and there's a difference between an energy efficient building and a decarbonized building. I just gave this talk yesterday at the California Efficiency Demand Council at their annual meeting, and I literally kind of threw up a slide and said, hey, there's a difference between a zero net energy building and an energy efficient building and a decarbonized building. These things aren't the same. What is it that we're ultimately headed towards and why? And so you could have a building that's relatively inefficient, but it could still theoretically be an all electric building, and maybe it could be decarbonized. Is that what we are okay with? You know, I personally think that we need to have the most efficient decarbonized buildings possible, but there are reasons for all of this. By sector, our buildings account for about 1/3 of the total greenhouse gas emissions that we're going after. Just a little bit of background of what some of the recent legislative activity that's been out there. California is just starting to implement 2 pieces of legislation on buildings themselves. They are what's called the Tech and Build programs, clean heating, and I'm forgetting what the build acronym stands for at the moment. I will think of it in 2 seconds. It is Building Initiative for Low Emissions Development, or BUILD. I'm glad I wrote things down in my notes because I would never remember that off the top of my head. This is about $200 million, which sounds like a lot of money. It's actually not all that much money. It's really sort of an amuse-bouche of money to really try and figure out how do we get the industry to start thinking out, how do they start transforming heating technologies within our buildings to get them to decarbonize. And it's really a technology-focused move, and it's both for new construction and for existing buildings. So it's about $200 million being spread out over 4 years, so $50 million a year. We're just starting to figure out how to implement this. There's a rulemaking going live at the Public Utilities Commission right now. There's a staff proposal that's out. We've given some commentary saying, this is great, this is horrible, and trying to figure out what makes the most sense. And then within that, there's also a lot of other signals that are out there on, well, what does it mean to decarbonize our buildings? And the California Energy Commission came out in their Integrated Energy Policy Report with a pretty bold declaration, which also sort of isn't that bold if you think about it. But the declaration was, well, if we're moving to an all-electric carbon neutral grid, and we want to decarbonize our buildings, well, the best and fastest and most cost-effective way to decarbonize a building, for the most part, is to electrify it. Well, that's great. That's okay. We've got a pathway. That's what we're doing. But the thing that I think a lot about is, well, if we're electrifying a lot of our buildings, what does that mean for the legacy assets that are in the ground for natural gas pipelines? And that's what the core of this talk is going to be about today, is trying to figure out, what do we do with all that natural gas infrastructure? And to be perfectly honest, this is the leading edge of the conversation. Environmental Defense Fund has sort of spent a huge amount of our time thinking about the gas pipeline, whether it's gas pipeline integrity, avoiding leaks, going after methane leaks in particular is something that we've really gotten a huge amount of wins out of. And we've done a lot of huge new investment as a state into pipeline integrity management. And that's a good thing for a whole host of reasons that we can talk about if you want. But we've spent a lot of money, $60+ billion, into our economy, into the pipeline that's in the ground. And now we're saying we're not going to use it. That doesn't make sense. And so what does that mean? What are we going to do? How do we reconcile the money that we spent, the money that we're going to need to spend to maintain a safe and reliable gas system, with this policy need to try and decarbonize our buildings as much as possible? So if y'all are willing, that's what we're going to try and talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. So here's just a really quick snapshot on the California gas system itself. The good news is that the gas pipeline system, for the most part, about 97–98% of the gas pipeline system is regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. They are investor-owned utility investments. There are a couple of municipal utilities that have gas utilities out there. Palo Alto is probably the closest to here at St. Davis. There's a handful up in the very this northern corner of the state. Oh, you can't see it on cursor. That northern part of the state. There's a handful of really small public utilities, but it's minuscule in reality. And so because this is a highly regulated system, that means that we have regulatory solutions to figure out the money that's in the ground. So a little bit of Ratemaking 101. And this is what the Public Utilities Commission does. This is their bread and butter. A regulated monopoly, for those of you who haven't heard the phrase before, and I'm assuming most people have, but let's just, in case there's the one person in the room who hasn't, let's just make certain all of our terms are good. A regulated utility, by definition, says, all right, I am a natural monopoly, and that means that I have no competition with my customers. It's economically inefficient to have one set of power lines going up the street and another set of power lines coming down the street. The fixed costs are just too high. And so for the gas pipeline system, we have granted by service territory on this previous map, those are the dedicated service territories, so there is no competition. But in order to make an investment, you have to reach this threshold of what's called used and useful. If you're going to collect money from your customers and you're going to be granted what's called a grant of public convenience and necessity, you have to reach certain thresholds and you have to say that, yes, this asset that I'm going to spend money on and collect money from my customers over a long period of time is going to be those used and useful. Well, what the heck does that mean? That's kind of an obscure phrase. So used and useful is that the asset itself is actually being used, shocker, but it's actually providing real service, and that the usefulness is without that asset, without whatever that widget is that we're putting in the ground, in this case a pipeline, the cost to the customer would have been higher, or the service itself would have been worse. Fancy way of saying that I can't gold plate, I can't just bring in the most whiz-bang thing possible. I can't, get a brand new, $500 Montblanc pen when a 30-cent pen would be fine. You have to make certain the costs are what's called just and reasonable, but that the asset that you're spending money on is going to meet this threshold. And if it meets this threshold, then the utility is allowed to put that asset into rate base and is allowed to earn money or earn profit on it. The one other thing that I will mention as we kind of go into this is the utilities themselves collect a lot of money from their customers for all sorts of things that they don't actually earn profit on. There is a concept called rate base, which means that this is a physical infrastructure, physical capital. That's what the utilities earn money on. But operating expenses, hey, I need to pay my workers healthcare costs this year. Well, they shouldn't earn profit on that. That's just normal, cost of doing business. They shouldn't earn profit on their tax base or on, wait a second, I need to, buy a new computer this week. Those are just normal operating expenses. So for the gas utilities, the gas costs themselves are completely deregulated. It's just an open gas market. Where the gas utilities themselves earn money is on the pipe in the ground. But as I sort of said a second ago, wait a second, we're saying that we might want to decarbonize our buildings, and the best way to do that is to use the electricity system. So what do we do with all that pipes that's in the ground? And really, what do we do knowing the fact that the way that the gas utility earns money is on the thing that we don't want them to be using anymore? Well, that doesn't make sense. So I just will note on this slide, and we're going to go into a little bit of economics. It's not going to be scary, I promise. But I just want to note that used and useful is not any one term that I can find written down in law. It is a body of case law that has evolved over time. And so the Public Utilities Commission here in the state has a lot of discretion in determining, but on a case-by-case basis, yes, this is a used and useful asset, or no, you're no longer using this asset, something has gone wrong, and we'll take it out of rate base. You shouldn't earn money on this anymore. And there is a bit of code, that same amount of flexibility that's out there. It's California Public Utilities Code section 451, which says that rates must be just and reasonable. Well, what does that mean, just and reasonable? Like that's, there's discretion behind it. Now, there's a lot of examples of what just and reasonable means. There's a lot of examples of what used and useful means over time. And so I actually have a chart later on that will, if you guys are really wanting to nerd out on some of the case law, I've actually included some of those examples that are out there. But going into a little bit of this for the gas pipeline, and this is about as technical of a graph as we're ever going to get in this talk. I tried to present to some real basic economics here. Well, green good, orange not good, right? And we'll get some other sophisticated colors, but the basic vocabulary here is, well, if I had an asset, if I had a 60-year investment of pipe, and this was a really expensive new pipe that I was going to put in, well, I'm not going to ask to collect all the money for my customers on day one. That's a huge spike in prices. Nobody could ever afford that. I'm going to spread out the cost of that pipeline over a period of time, so that way the rate shock for that new investment is nice and gentle and easy. Well, what's the right amount of time that I would spread that out across? Well, the life of the asset, and I'll just fully depreciate that asset. So the idea is, if I have a 60-year life asset, and 60 years is sort of ballpark the life of the pipeline, if I have a 60-year long life asset, I'm going to want to collect the cost of that over 60 years. Now, how I actually pay for it, the construction costs and everything else, the utilities will finance that and take out some loans and take out some bonds, and they will do some their financial accounting to figure that part out. That's a separate story. But the actual rate of return that they earn on that asset and the revenue stream for it will be over the life of the asset. So the idea is, before we started doing anything, you would say, all right, how much money would I recover from the thing? Well, I would start and I would spread that out, and imagine that entire box being green to start with. But now we're saying, wait a second, we're going to start electrifying a little bit. We're going to start taking a little bit of usefulness, a little bit of that use category out of the equation. Maybe one customer says, you know what? I'm going to be an early adopter and I'm going to electrify my home, and I'm taking out that gas water heater. I don't care. I'll put in an electric one. That'll work just as fine for me. Well, you have now one fewer customer. A little bit of feedback. Okay.
Sometimes if you're right in front of the speaker and behind you, the gray box, like you're lined up.
Okay. Hopefully that's a little bit better. So if I have one fewer customer on my system, it's not going to matter. It's pennies on the dollar of that. But if I start having a neighborhood starting to go away, or a municipality, we just saw the city of Berkeley, Mountain View, San Jose, municipalities are now starting to talk about, oh, we're going to electrify all new construction. Well, then things are a little bit different. And so what this graph is trying to show you guys is there's eventually going to be a decline in how much that pipeline is going to be used. And what the utility was promised at the beginning of when they put this pipe in the ground and said, yes, you are allowed to recover this amount of money over this much time. Well, they're now not going to recover as much money as they were expecting. So I only ask questions that are really baked into the answer. The answer is baked into the question. If I was expecting to collect money from 100 customers and now 5 have left and I've got 95 remaining, who's going to pay the cost of those customers who have left? The other 95. Yeah, not hard. Now there is, and that's essentially what's being shown in this first graph is, all right, in order to make up that revenue requirement, the utility has to probably at some point raise rates a little bit on the other 95 customers because those 5 have left. Now, I'm using a hypothetical example here. It's never as simple as 105, but you kind of get a sense of it. There's one other thing that I would argue before we get into the stranded asset part of it that's just an important kind of tenet of rate making. It's all about what the utility knew at the time they made the decision. Things go sideways. We have natural disasters, we have earthquakes, we have wildfires, we have all sorts of things that happen. And it's about what did you do making the best investment decision on behalf of your customers at the time you made the decision with the information in front of you. Hindsight is always 20/20. And there's always going to be times that come about that say, you know what, we made a wrong decision, and sometimes those are the breaks. And if the utility could have made a better, smarter decision with the information it had at its time, and elected not to because they were acting more in the interest of their shareholders and of their customers, then we would say they acted imprudently, and any lost exposure would be on their shareholders, not on their customers. But on the flip side, if the world changed on them for reasons completely exogenous to what they knew at the time they made a decision, such as we decided that we wanted to decarbonize our economy in year 35 of the 60-year life asset, well, the decision to put new pipe in the ground, that already happened. That die is cast. The utilities should not necessarily be left holding the bag for that. Now, they might need to be holding the bag if they said, okay, now we're going to put in a brand new pipe, but yes, there's this whole new decarbonization thing that's happening, and maybe we're not going to use these assets. You know, future decision making with future investments is a different story. And what we're going to be talking about for the next 3 or 4 slides is really going to be about the legacy investments and the legacy infrastructure that's out there. So the question is, if I had 100 customers that I was expecting to recover money from, and now 95 were part of the system, and there were 5 that had left, well, what do I do with that stranded value? What do I do with that money that I was expecting to collect, but now I'm not collecting? And really what I'm just trying to show right now is we as a state are trying to make a pretty aggressive transition to electrifying as much of the economy as we can. We are trying to decarbonize under a pretty aggressive time frame, but there's going to be pipe that's left in the ground.
Here, either child is moving you a little bit this way.
Okay.
Because the speaker's right here, and so sometimes.
Okay.
And if that doesn't work, then we'll just take it off because people will hear you fine.
Okay. Is this better? Okay. All right. So all I'm trying to show in this graph is basically a way to visually represent, all right, as we anticipate electrification is going to start really, really slowly over time, and it's going to expand. And you could theoretically expect a time where the entire system has decarbonized. It's no longer, for the most part, for this very, very crude example, is no longer using the asset, but there's some money that's left on the table. So the green is what's already been recovered. The yellow is what we anticipate, even though it's not happened yet, will still be recovered. And that orange value is the amount of money that needs to get made up in some way, that value that has been left stranded. Well, how much money is that? Well, we don't know. I actually think this is worse.
Is it worse? Okay, take it off. We can hear you.
Okay.
It's fine.
Sorry, you guys.
I'll go make sure on Zoom that we can hear you.
Okay. Go like that. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, and I've got an absurdly loud voice, so if y'all need me to do more, just let me know. So, how much money is needed for this? How much stranded value are we talking about? How much is that value of that orange area? We don't know. This is not, it's like some impossible research question. It's, the numbers are out there. We just as a state have not done the math yet. And the utilities themselves, I don't think, have done the math. They know more or less how much money they're owed, but you're gonna have to do a little bit of modeling and a little bit of assumptions of, well, what is the current book value of the system? How much money is sort of left in the ground right now? And then you have to do a little bit of assumptions of, well, what is the adoption rate of electrification? You have to kind of figure some things out. But this isn't an impossible thing to figure out. This is not some huge Monte Carlo simulation or anything else. This is algebra. But we do have to figure out a little bit on, well, what is the remaining valuation of the investments, what I would call the book value? What's the recovery time? Because we didn't start and just put all the pipe in the ground all at the exact same time. We invested over time, and so some assets have 5 years left, some assets have 50 years left, and so we have to just figure that out as well. Some of this is going to be based on geography. And I will come back to that in a second, but there are different parts of the system that have different types of pipe in the ground. There's, the state is not a uniform thing. I will argue in a second that the amount of value that's left in the pipeline system is going to be based a little bit on, well, should we be electrifying in places where the stranded value, that amount of gas pipeline value that's left is really small. So that way we're not leaving money on the table. I'll come back to that in a second. Well, what's the implications of leaving that money in the ground, of, as more and more customers leave the system, of having that value that needs to be recovered? Well, think about this for a second. If I'm going to spend in my private home, and I own a small condo in San Francisco, and I decide that I want to electrify all the things that are gas related. So I want to put in an electric stove, I want to put into this, I want to put into that. I can afford to do that. Great, I've left the system. I've made some private investments and I've made that happen. But I'm relatively, I'm a professional, I have relatively good income. I work in environmental nonprofits, so it's not huge, but I have relatively good income. Think about the person who doesn't have that access to capital, who is going to be left holding the bag and still part of the system. They're probably not as housing secure. They're probably not as financially secure. They might be lower income. They might be renters. They might be disproportionate impacts onto the customers that we actually don't want to be feeling that impact. And so there are some policy trade-offs of, as we start this transition, the folks who are going to be feeling that, picking up that slack are going to be probably the customers who are the more vulnerable, and they're exact opposite of the ones that we wanted to be having pay for this. So that's just something we need to think about, is that there's going to be an overall rate increase on the remaining customers, and there's an equity component to that. There's also a question of, and we've seen this already, when I released this white paper, which I think the link might have been sent around to folks with part of this, when I wrote that, the city of Berkeley was the only city in the country that had talked about maybe for new construction adopting this REACH code and abandoning natural gas for future new construction. The state of California in the last 6 months has now upped that to 12, and I think there's probably another 20 or so that are in deep contemplation. This is not some hypothetical exercise, this is happening. And so the momentum for clean energy is out there. This is going to happen. There was an op-ed written by the mayor of San Jose, Sam Liccardo, in the San Francisco Chronicle this week, very persuasively talking about why cities need to get off gas and get off it now. Go and look it up if you guys haven't already. I've talked a little bit about the equity issues, but I wanted to say it again. There are equity impacts to all of this. Investor confidence is something that I think a lot about. And this is something that you can study. This is something that I am in a case at the Public Utilities Commission right now arguing over what is the investment risk to California. The basic concept here is, if California says to a utility, those are then breaks, you need to recover that money from your shareholders and not from your customers, you made a bad decision, and we reverse on something that we had made a promise to, that makes California look like a riskier place to do business. And therefore, what comes with risk when you make an investment? A higher interest rate. New investments are more expensive when there is high risk. New investments are less expensive when there is low risk. And so we are talking about, for building decarbonization, if we're going to electrify all the end uses for buildings in this state, somewhere about electric load growth of 2 to 3x our current system. It's a huge amount of new investment that's going to be required. We want that investment to be as low risk as possible. And Wall Street doesn't care about, oh, well, this is electricity and this is gas. They just care about California. And so if we make the California utilities look like a riskier place to do business, if we make them have to have certain shareholder disallowances because of how we handle legacy investments, new investments are going to be more expensive. It is a direct relationship. And we think that new investments into clean energy technology they are low risk investments, and we need to keep them that way. So a lot of the things that I talk about when I talk about the solutions to all this stuff is all about keeping the investor confidence and risk profile low. you have a question?
Yeah, you seem to be sort of enthusiastic about this investor confidence. And I think it's really important because I just wonder currently if California utilities are paying higher interest rates already. I mean, thinking about increased risk, you said maybe we can talk about the wildfires later. You know,
yeah, it's a great.
PG&E declared bankruptcy.
I'm aware.
I mean, and so like there is already a for this natural disaster issue, which is unique a little bit in California.
I definitely want to talk about it. I'm going to put a pin in this towards the end because I think it's a deeper conversation, and I think I'm going to talk a little bit about this in some of the slides, but if I haven't answered it fully enough, I want to. So a couple of other things that I think are equally worth talking about. Who here was living in California in the year 2010? Show of hands. Who here was thinking about energy issues in the year 2010? Sort of, okay. There was, unfortunately, one of the country's, to date, the country's largest natural gas pipeline disaster here in California, in the city of San Bruno. It's a suburb outside of San Francisco. 80 homes were destroyed, 8 people died, including a friend of mine, a colleague of mine from the Public Utilities Commission, a natural gas rate advocate, actually, and her 8-year-old daughter. I mean, this was a horrible, tragic accident. And it really woke up not just California, but the entire industry into the need of, we need to do much, much better on natural gas pipeline safety issues. Natural gas pipelines were always considered to be relatively safe, and this was sort of a bread and butter thing. And this has encouraged, since that explosion 9 years ago, this has encouraged, or encouraged is the wrong word, this has motivated, I think is the better word, a massive amount of new investment into the pipeline system to help make certain that they are safe and reliable. So that means over the last 10 years, we have spent billions of dollars, capital B billions of dollars in this state, improving the pipeline integrity, both at the distribution and transmission level. So, and we're going to need to keep doing that. So we're spending more new money in the system, but we're also saying we want to be using it less. And so there are trade-offs that are going to be happening in real time, and we need to think about that. So there are some solutions that are out there. Now that I sort of laid out all the complexity of these problems, I don't like just talking about problems. I like talking about, well, how do we handle this? So I'm going to go through a couple of rate-making solutions that are out there that California has done before. This is not new. This is not innovative. Austin and I were talking a little bit before. A lot of energy policy is the same conversation. It's just in new, interesting ways. And so you don't have to come up with some like whiz-bang new policy solution. You just have to think about how do we have the solutions to pass and apply it onto a new topic. And so these are going to be 4 of the things that I kind of go through, and I'm going to show you how the rate making works on each of these. So strategic electrification is one of the ones that I think is really interesting. So if I have 2 neighborhoods that are relatively similar profile, similar property values, similar motivation, similar customer segment profiles, but and both are wanting to decarbonize. And I'm trying to figure out where do I spend my next dollar to do that. Well, let's just say the only difference between these 2 neighborhoods is one is got a relatively paid off, relatively fully depreciated pipeline system. And the other one has just had a massive amount of new investment. They had leaky pipes, and we just spent a good chunk of cash improving their pipeline. Well, if I had to choose between those 2 neighborhoods, which one to electrify, I'm going to choose that first one because there's very little money left in the ground. The money has been more or less depreciated. We're going to kind of go for it. We're going to say they're the ones that make the most sense. We're going to choose them first. And so one of the arguments that EDF is making is as we're trying to figure out where do we start electrifying our buildings, where do we do that, where does it make the most sense? Well, let's do it strategically and use the pipeline value of what's in the ground as a screener, everything else being equal. And the value of doing that is that the amount of money that is not being recovered, that stranded value, is by definition as minimized as possible. It's not ever going to be completely zero, but it's pretty close. And so that's just one really easy thing to do. But you're now asking, from sort of a planning perspective to be talking gas and electric sort of at the same time. And that's not something that the state normally thinks about. It's sort of some innovative policy making of, what do you mean I have to be using as a screen the gas pipeline system when I want to be, you know, in the book value, but like those are different systems and sometimes they're different companies. So this is just one way of trying to minimize this. And so one of the things that we're doing is saying, compared to our last graph, that blue hashed area is now basically no longer going to be a stranded value because we've essentially fully depreciated that. We were smarter in how we electrify. So are there system benefits from where we are basically having to avoid having to do a new pipeline upgrade? And are there overall ratepayer benefits, customer benefits from building in how we target electrification into this equation? So that's just one really easy thing to do as we're coming up with the new rulemakings on how are we going to electrify. Let's just use the pipeline system and the assets and the book value that's out there and where we're going to be targeting pipeline investments as a screener.
What are we assuming about the recovery of the stranded assets? Are we assuming that the utility is recovering?
So what the assumption that I am making for each of these is going back to, thank you for asking that because I should have been clear. What I'm assuming for each of these is that because the promise that was made at the time that the utility has been granted that what's called the CPC, Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, to say, yes, that you need to put this new pipe in the ground, it's going to be a used and useful asset, you are allowed to recover this much money. We're trying to figure out how to let them recover this much money because the world has changed not because of their imprudent action, but because exogenous new policy things have happened. And so they are still entitled to that money. Now I will show you in a graph later what it looks like if we disagree with that assumption, but that is the assumption that we're going with all of these.
Are we assuming at all that rates vary geographically based on the capital used to serve me?
So the answer is no. The question was asked, is there a geographic difference in rates? Well, let's say that Austin has a brand new subdivision and he has a lot of money in his ground and I live in a 150-year-old neighborhood and that has been more or less paid for. Doesn't matter, we're all social customers. You know, I pay a little bit of his bill, he pays a little bit of my bill. It's all one big giant melting pot. That is how Ratemaking works. There is sometimes where there are cost responsibilities or cost causation. For the purposes of natural gas pipelines, we're going to ignore that for now. So the first solution that I presented was, well, how do we just minimize that stranded value that might exist? Can we do some target electrification? But there's still going to be some. So how do we finance that early retirement of the things that's left? Well, there are some different options that are out there. I'm going to go through a couple of them. And just like anything else, it's money, and there's going to be some winners and losers. And it just depends on what are the stakeholders that are out there. But right now, what we're talking about is paper. You know, we're just talking about money. So in this example, there's something called securitization. This is something that's been really popular with coal-fired power plants that have been essentially deemed no longer useful. We securitize them through a bond. We can do the exact same thing with a natural gas pipeline. Basically, you take an estimated value of how much money was going to be left not covered, that stranded value, and you pick a period of time and you say, I'm going to finance that through a bond. The bond rate is going to be cheaper by definition because interest rates are relatively low compared to what the profit motive of the utility is. And we're not spreading this out over as much time, so you get some interest savings, you get some depreciation savings. And so you'll notice the value of that purple sort of parallelogram is going to be equal in terms of the actual dollar amount of what was going to be spread out, that I can essentially securitize that. The utility is left indifferent, but the ratepayers themselves get to save a little bit of money. And so that's one really easy option that's out there. This is going to require a legislative bond and would require an act of legislation. There would have to be some, rate-making determinations. Well, how much money are we talking about? Are you in? Are you out? Have you exited? What does that make sense? But again, this is math. We can figure this out. California has a history of doing this, by the way. In the lead up to deregulation in the mid-90s, there was a lot of power plants that were going to be left stranded by the utilities, and we actually just securitized those with a bond and then sold off some of the other thermal fleet and other things. So this isn't some hypothetical thing. California has done this in the past on energy investments. Let me get through 2 more slides, and then I do want to take questions, but I don't be mindful of the clock. There is another way to do this where we basically say, well, wait a second, even if the useful life of the asset is going to be for another 30 years, we're not going to recover the money over 30 years. We're going to recover the money over a shorter period of time. We're going to recover that money over, say, 20 years or 15 years or 18 years. The number here doesn't matter. It's just that we're going to accelerate that time frame. Now, by definition, if I originally wanted to recover that money over the longest period of time to keep rates as low as possible, if I'm now going to accelerate that, that means rates are going to go up for customers. But what that means is that the customers who are paying the bills today and are making the decisions today to electrify are the ones who are also taking on the cost responsibility of the increased rates. And I'm not passing the buck of, oh, wait, I have this stranded value, that will be the next generation's problem. And when we think about it, some of the things that we're paying for in rates today were decisions that were made when you have assets that are this long-lived. These are decisions that were being made by my parents, my grandparents. And so part of this is the responsibility of, well, this is the intergenerational component that I was talking about a few minutes ago. If we accelerate depreciation now, the customers who are making the decision to try and say this is the policy turn, we are paying for that. There's some trade-offs in that, as you can imagine, but this is an option that's out there. Another one that I think is interesting is to be able to say there's going to be a change on what's called the utility's return on equity. That's a fancy way of saying their profit. A regulated utility has a profit motive, and this is a regulated amount set by the Public Utilities Commission. I, on behalf of EDF, am arguing with the utilities right now about what their return on equity should be for the next several years. And you can make a change to their ROE for an asset that has been sort of set aside in this stranded class and saying, this is no longer a used and useful asset, so you aren't going to be earning as much profit as you once expected. You'll recover the money that you were promised, but you don't need to earn quite as much profit as you once did. And we have changed and basically lowered the ROE down to like the cost of debt for several assets that had been deemed no longer used and useful for whatever reason. So not a hypothetical, we have done this before. The last kind of interesting option that is out there, and I'm more presenting this for the sake of completeness, I don't think this is a viable option in California given the preambles that I've talked about, but you could allow just recovery. You could say to the utility, you know what? Climate change is something you all should have known about for a long time, and there's inherent nature of your business that you were moving gas around. Sucks to be you. And you all knew what you were getting into, and we're going to disallow. Now, I just made a fairly impassioned speech a few minutes ago of why I think that's a bad idea for the California economy because we have to be making so many new investments. So I just sort of recognize that this is an option that's on the table. And if you want, people do want to say, and there's a lot of sentiment out there, well, yeah, let's just stick it to the gas utility. They're a big bad fossil company. I am not a utility apologist by any stretch, but I think they do a lot of ill-advised things sometimes. But in this particular instance, we just need to recognize there's a trade-off of saying, yeah, you know what, tough, it sucks to be you. It is a viable option that's out there and will be advocated for by certain groups. And so we need to, for intellectual completeness, recognize that and recognize the trade-off that come with it. As promised, I did want to sort of mention that here are all the PUC decision numbers at really interesting spots of where of how the state has handled stranded assets over time. It really comes back to that prudent manager standard that I talked about a few minutes ago. Sometimes the utility acted imprudently, and so they were fully disallowed recovery of everything. Sometimes the world changed on them, sometimes it was a mixture of the two. So it always just sort of depends on what's going on. I'd like to point out this last one on the slide, which I thought was really interesting. I was working and advising a commissioner at the time on this. PG&E put in a series of smart meters that were what I would call quasi-smart, and then Edison went out and figured out a better meter to put in, and then PG&E said, oh wait, we need that level of capability too. And there was some money that was spent on brand new meters, but basically the technology changed kind of within them, and we had to figure out what was the right way to handle that. It's a really interesting case. So I've got only a couple more moments, a couple other things that I want to just quickly talk about. So everything that I've been talking about right now has been, how do we handle that money that's left in the ground? But there is also, once the asset itself is no longer being used and useful, if we had just reached the end of the recovery timeline, well, you would still have to deal with that asset at the end of its life. You'd have to pull it out of ground or fill it with cement or do whatever you need to do. And that's called the decommissioning cost. And if we're not, and decommissioning costs are always recovered throughout the life of the asset as well. So this is not a new cost of putting the asset in the ground, but we're recovering a little bit of money each month of taking that asset out of service when it's done. And now if we're accelerating that timeline, we have to also accelerate the decommissioning cost itself. So it's just another little added bonus sprinkle of something we got to figure out. And so as you're thinking about what do we do with all the legacy investments that are in the ground, we also have to figure out what do we do to get them out of the ground that are no longer being used anymore. So everything I've been talking about so far has been about the legacy stuff that's in the ground. What do we do for the new stuff? There are always new build in California. There is new construction. We are not necessarily banning on a statewide basis natural gas that's out there. Some people really want natural gas. And some people say, I really need this. And the utilities are underneath what's called an obligation to serve. If a customer comes to them and says, I want service, well, that's a basic human right and necessity. They must run a line to go out there and serve it. Now, the utility can offer incentives and say, hey, you know what? I'll offer you a really great rebate, and I'll put in the best all-electric stuff possible. I'll upgrade all your appliances. I'll do all these things because it's cheaper for me than running a pipeline out all this way. And they can do that, and a customer can waive their right to an obligation to serve. But if a customer demands it, the utility must obligate, and we all as customers must pay for that as a result. And so part of what we need to think about is what do we do with those new investments? The last sentence that I wanted to say here on new investments is, well, now the utility knows better. And now we might not be making investments for 60 years anymore. Maybe we'll be making investments for 20 years. Maybe we'll be making investments for 25 years so that we hit that 2045 date. And so the rate making and the use and usefulness conversation is different now than it was 10 years ago. And so part of the things we have to think about is where are we in time and what do we know at this point in time? And that's going to impact future investment decisions. Now I'm going to let you all in a little secret here, which is this is probably the biggest fight in the California environmental community within the decarb space right now. And I'm going to do my best to present both sides of this. There are alternative uses for a pipeline. And EDF's position has always been, we are not anti-pipe, we are anti-fossil gas. So if you could run other things in that gas pipeline other than fossil gas, then we wouldn't have the stranded asset problem anymore. And that's maybe not a bad thing. And so there are some questions that are out there of, well, are there other uses for that pipeline to keep it being used and useful other than gas pipeline? There's nothing magic about the pipe itself. It could be used to transport other things. Maybe, we don't know. There's a lot of scientific question right now of could we adapt the existing gas pipeline to use hydrogen? That's a fossil-free gas. Could we adapt it to be used renewable natural gas or syngases or all sorts of other options that are out there? There are questions of whether or not that makes sense from an economic perspective because those fuels are very expensive. I will note that Southern California Gas Company, which is the largest gas company in the country, has made a public voluntary commitment to do 20% of its entire throughput using renewable natural gas in the next 10 years. There's lots, they're trying to figure out ways of decarbonizing their system and still keep their investments intact. This is a very active space right now. And there's very heated debates of, is this a good thing or is this a distraction? This California Energy Commission's analysis is indicating, and there's a lot of other analysis out there as well, that the most cost-effective thing to do, even with the stranded pipe value, is to electrify the system, and then we figure out the cost containment of it all. I think there's still some more analysis that needs to be done. When you look at the price of renewable natural gas, when you look at the price of hydrogen, it's really expensive, 5-6x of what the price of natural gas as a commodity is right now. And so we have to figure this out, but there are some questions that I think are worthy of some really good, robust analysis. Now from, on this graph, what's the value of being able to use this? Well, if you can adapt your system to a new fuel, then you don't have a stranded asset value problem anymore. That situation goes away. So that's a big appealing option that we at least want to think about before we completely dismiss it. I think I've more or less talked about this, but saying if there are other roles that renewable natural gas can be using or hydrogen can be using in the short term, how do we use it? I'm involved in a case at the PUC right now. SoCalGas is asking for a voluntary tariff to let customers elect to pay more and to have some renewable gas flowing through their homes. This is somewhat similar to the early days of the renewable portfolio standard for electricity. There is no such thing as a green molecule of gas, right? It's just like there's no such thing as a green electron. But we have to figure out the standards and the accounting and everything else, but there is some offset that is, offset's the wrong word, that means something else in the current world. There is some alternative gas that is out there that we could use. And there are some profiles of where it might make sense. I personally argue, because this gas is so expensive and so limitedly available, that we want to use it in buildings where it's really hard to electrify, or the ownership model doesn't make sense. If I'm a renter and not an owner, I can't rip out equipment and put new stuff in. If I'm a heavy industry and I have a big thermal load, I can't electrify that. So let's use those as sort of our target priorities of where we might want to use some RNG in the near term. And this is sort of my last slide, and the thing that I want to sort of leave you all with of where I think the policy conversation is headed right now, which is I think we need to be thinking about the value of what's in the ground as part of the policy conversation as we're thinking about how we decarbonize our buildings. We need to have a little bit more just pure math and investigation. We need to be doing a little bit more of a focused, just data gathering exercise. It could be at the legislature, could be at the PC, could be somewhere else. And we need to then make that data as transparent as we can so that way we make smart investment decisions as a state. And the last thing that I will say is, I don't want this to be a paralysis by analysis situation. We need to keep moving forward on the electrification front, bringing the cost of electrifying end uses down because it is such a cost-effective thing. We need to be pushing forward on decarbonizing our electric grid. And we can do these things at the same time. We can walk and chew gum. So don't let the gas questions that I've raised and posed to you all today stop any of that forward momentum that's out there, but just know we got to figure it out. And with that, thank you all so much for listening. That's sort of the end of the formal part. I want to open it up to as many questions as we can get to, either on this stuff or if there are other energy things you have questions about, we can go to that. Yeah, and go ahead and say your name also.
Hi, I'm Greg Miller.
Hi, Greg. Nice to meet you.
One of the questions was that one of your assumptions is about the fact that there's this momentum towards electrification, and obviously there is a lot of momentum towards electrifying new construction, but as far as I'm aware, nobody has proposed like a practical solution for electrifying existing buildings yet, and the new construction is just a really tiny sliver on top of what we already have. So yeah. I just don't know how we even come up with a timeline for electrification when we don't have a...
Well, welcome to my world. No, the build and tech programs, one of those is for new construction, one of those is for existing. And I think what we need to be focusing on is sort of hitting the sweet spot of, I have a water heater in a home, it's 15 years expected useful life. How do I motivate it so that way when we hit the end of that useful life of that water heater, that there is a viable option and with very low permitting costs and building stock costs and everything else to say, you know what, the most cost effective option for you to put in is not a replacement gas water heater, but it's an electric water heater. And I think if you can show the customer some bill savings, that will help motivate it. And if you can show them some rebates, that will also help motivate it. One of the things that I think is also really interesting, and I could geek out for another 20 minutes on water heaters, I won't, but nobody really cares when their water gets heated, they just want to take a shower. And from the same time, if you put for like not that much more money on an electric resistance water heater, a grid control attached to it, well, now you have another huge resource to help you with grid balancing that is completely invisible to the customer, but a huge added benefit to the grid and to the system. And when you talk about huge added benefits to the system, that means money and that means bill savings to customers. So I think there are some ways of integrating demand response type options into the decarbonization story. And it's, I think, our job as policy advocates to try and figure out how do we make that a presentable option for when that unit is going to turn over. Yeah, go ahead. And say your name.
My name is Devin.
Devin, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I was wondering about, you kind of prefaced this at the beginning, but the added value of gas, natural gas for resilience when the grid will go down.
Yeah. So there are, it's a great question, and I think about resilience a lot. When I talk about affordable, clean, and safe grid, the things that are safe is that it is the system resilient. That is one of the core things underneath that word. Safe covers a lot. I've been thinking about this a lot for a while now, and especially given how high profile those public safety power shutoffs were in the last few weeks, and then there's more shutoffs that are happening right now also. I think two things. The first is there are going to be high reliability organizations that no matter what are going to need to figure out what are the best options for them. And whether gas is the right option or storage is the right option or biogas with on-site generation, you're going to have to figure things out. So if you're a high reliability organization, a hospital or a food manufacturer, there's lots of places that consider themselves to fall into that category. There are probably private investments that you're going to want to make regardless of what's going on in the broader context of these public shutoffs and everything else. Putting them aside, what does that mean for us as a society? Well, the grid that we have today is not the grid that we would design if we were starting from scratch. You would never design a system that looks like this. And just like you would never design a gas pipeline system that looks like this. This was a series of decisions that was made over time. But we are sort of putting out the trumpet call to everyone saying we're going to do a massive amount of new investment into our electric infrastructure over the next 20 years in order to decarbonize our economy. 2 to 3x load growth in buildings, another 2 to 3x load growth for transportation, and probably another 1 to 2x just for the heavy trucks. Which means we have the opportunity to make different investment choices into our electric grid to build that resilience in than what we have today. So I think we have to just be smart about how we are making investments into the grid to make it work for where we're headed, which is a decarbonized economy, not where we are today. And that's just a planning exercise, and planning is fun. Other questions? Yeah, and say your name.
Jake.
Jake, nice to meet you.
Okay, this is a follow-up question about resilience.
Oh, exciting.
Do you think there are a lot of voices coming out of these shutoffs that have a vested interest in gas that are going to be like arguing, look, this electricity is completely unreliable. This is why we cannot get off gas. Gas is reliable. And do you think that people overrate the reliability of the current gas system in some ways? Or like, how do you view that, given like if there's an earthquake, that's a huge vulnerability, and obviously there's still explosions. risk and corrosion.
And well, and you don't even need a big natural disaster to have the gas system be unresilient. You could have a dig in and somebody didn't call it 811 first, and all of a sudden you have, a dig in and pitches on a system and you have an explosion. Like that's just the nature of the beast. Jake, I think you're asking a very astute question in terms of the trade-offs on where is the customer going to experience better both quality of service and uptime of service between these two systems, and is it a mixture of the two? And I think that's going to be a choice that each customer is going to have to make. I think right now we track for the electric utilities safety targets, duration and frequency of outages, and they have shareholder incentives to stay up as much as possible, and I think that will only continue. People are genuinely and rightfully so very angry about these public shutoffs. I mean, it was horrible. This was the largest planned shutoff that PG&E did 2 weeks ago or 11 days ago, whatever the math is. This was the largest planned shutoff in the country's history. I mean, this is not just another like day in the life. This was a singular event. Now it happened to be kind of a confluence of a bunch of things. I think the utilities themselves are going to be making different investment choices in terms of how they're hardening their system, the insulation that they use, the cameras that they're using to track. The reason for the length of the shutoff was really driven by the fact after the wind event was done, you have to go out and visually inspect every single inch of the lines to make certain that there aren't impingements. There was over, PG&E reported last Friday, there were over 100 points of failure on their system. Tree branches hitting, sometimes there was a down pole. There was, the shutoff worked in the sense that it was there. In answer to the other part of your question in terms of, do I see a big thrust of, well, this is why we got to stay on gas or not? I haven't seen that yet. It's only been a week or two. I think there are other issues of, or other motivations that are out there. I talk with a lot of just individual customers about this work. Most people don't really care how their water heater is powered. They don't really care about how their gas, how their electric heater for heat is used. They don't really care about some of the other things, their pool pump, that kind of stuff. They really care passionately about their stoves. And I think that is actually it's amazing. Yeah. People this is what's feeding your kids. This is how you're nourishing yourself. There's cultural components to it that there's some things that an electric stove just will not do. Now I'm actually a big cook and a big baker, and I have an all-electric stove. I love it because it actually is better for baking, but that's neither here nor there. And I think that's actually probably the bigger cultural conversation than anything else. And I don't think it's a resilience question so much as it is a cultural question.
I'll just add that came up. I've been working with cities of Sacramento and West Sacramento that are considering policies to go both for new and existing buildings to electrification. Yeah. And we expected the development community to be the strongest pushback, and they weren't. They were pushback, but the restaurant community was the strongest pushback. They were like, don't take away our gas.
And we actually have, we're partnering, there's something called the California Building Decarbonization Coalition. EDF is a member, and the BDC is actually partnering with world famous chefs from around the country who are in all electric kitchens, and these are Michelin star chefs, and they prefer to be in an all electric kitchen. There are trade-offs, but it's really amazing the passion that people feel about that lighting range. I know you had a question, but let's do you and then you, if you don't mind. And remind me of your name.
My name's Nick.
Nick, nice to meet you.
Former PUC staffer too, so this is kind of my question.
My sympathies, yes.
Yeah. And this is about the total stranded value, right? And if rates are homogeneous across geographic space, then the total value of stranded assets is not a function of the legacy system as much as it is the number of customers and the amount that they consume. So strategically electrifying doesn't seem to have a rate impact, whether you choose an area where the stuff is already depreciated or not. Like, the money
yes-
that you
yes and
strand
no.
is just a function of how many customers
Not
and how much they consume.
yes and no. The reason why is it's about whether or not that asset's in rate base. So if you are no longer putting that asset, if you're no longer using that gas pipeline, you take it out of rate base, and depending on what you take out of rate base is going to have so if I have the segment the feeder, let's say in the city of Berkeley, I'm making something up right now, but that main feeder in the city of Berkeley has now gone all electric, or in the future, and we're no longer using that. Well, you look at the remaining value of that one asset, and that's what you take out, and the depreciation of that one asset is going to impact how much is happening. The geographic part of it is not like we say the city of Berkeley is going to just pay those costs and nobody else. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. There is a question that's out there right now if we should be paying exit fees. But that feeder for the city of Berkeley might be different than, say, the city of Fresno. And so that's, so it's the rate-based value, the remaining book value. We actually do distinguish that depending on the age and life of that asset. It just depends on when it went in. Yes, go ahead. And say your name.
My name's Ryan.
Nice to meet you, Ryan.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate on securitization and why it's better than just raising rates and where the money comes from.
Sure. So I don't think I was not trying to present my thumb on the scale on any of these options. I'm actually pretty indifferent to each of them. These are just sort of options that are out there. So securitization, the source of the revenue, it's a legislative bond, so it's an increase in your taxes. But the bond value itself, that interest rate is going to be lower than the utilities ROE, and so therefore you're saving some money. And the other kind of societal thing that I would argue is that the move to decarbonize is a tax, or excuse me, the move to decarbonize and to raise funds through a tax or paying off a bond might make sense in this instance because we were talking about something that is a societal issue and it is not just a one individual dam going out of service or something like that. This is something that we as a state are making a policy choice on. So I could make an argument that we as a state need to pick up the costs. Yeah, go ahead.
So maybe one option you didn't present that I want to put out as a provocative statement, not as a recommendation. But you talked about why natural gas utilities are not necessarily the good ones to put all the costs on, right? The investors, because they're a regulated utility. There's a lot of good reasons that they are sort of held to public account. There are other companies that have made a great deal of money selling fossil fuels to those utilities.
Sure.
That in theory could pay some of the cost of transition either through higher carbon taxes or other sorts of approaches or other strategies. So did you look at anything where you take that stranded value and put it on the fossil fuel producer company instead?
We did not, and the reason why was because it looked like an inherent subsidy that just didn't make sense. It looked like a wealth transfer from one corporation to another in a way that just didn't make sense, and we generally wouldn't do that in a regulated industry like that. We did look at and consider, well, could we use, say, cap and trade money, where the cap and trade money is, put on from, different sources and help use to offset some of these costs. And we did look at that, and that's just sort of, but there's a lot of people looking for that cost of money that's out there. It ultimately comes back to, those gas companies themselves have not necessarily had anything to do with the investment decisions that the gas utilities made. And so, whether or not they were going to be serving this customer or not, this service or not,
The gas companies are pretty active in the policy discussions around how we make public investments.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I hear your point, and I think it's just sort of the way that you would probably do that, though, is through collecting money through some sort of tax or some sort of fee or some sort of something, and then you disperse it back onto the customer rate or bill. That's a surcharge or a surcredit. So it's going to have to go back into one of these things anyways. And so the source of the revenue of how you're going to say do accelerated depreciation, if you want to offset that through the accelerated depreciation through that as a revenue source, sure. I think you had a question. I'm also mindful of the time, so I don't want to keep you all from a lunch. If you have places to go, I will not be offended.
I'm John.
Hey, John.
So thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to say, I really thought that my perspective on EDF was more that you were just sort of like pushing environmental causes more through analysis and sort of legal action. And so I've been really impressed with all the perspectives you're taking into account, like the depth at which you're approaching the problem. It almost feels like you're doing the job of the regulator by like taking all the stakeholders and trying to figure out what really is the best, taking all that into account, other than just being one of the voices influencing the process. So it feels like you've earned yourself at a spot at this table without being, you know, the state. And I guess I was kind of wondering if you could speak to how EDF got to that point and the extent to which you are like part of that regulation process.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the compliment. And I say that as a recovering regulator. You know, and I didn't say this explicitly enough at the beginning of the talk, but during my 10 years at the commission, about half of them were spent as advisors to commissioners on energy issues and on rate-making issues. So you know, really got to see up and close how these decisions get made. So you can actually see it on this underneath our logo right here. The EDF's tagline is finding the ways that work. And I think that means having credibility and speaking from a place of deep technical knowledge, deep economic knowledge, deep scientific knowledge, deep regulatory knowledge. And I hope that I demonstrated a little bit of regulatory knowledge in front of you all today. And you know, I've got an amazing team of people that work with me and for me to help kind of complement that. EDF tries to be really targeted, especially on energy issues in California, where we do and do not engage. You know, we don't want to be one of the 1,000 voices. We really want to be in places where we think we have a unique perspective and where we will be able to lend expertise in places that we might not have otherwise, you know, might not be part of the conversation otherwise. I think I have mentioned that one of the cases that I'm involved in is the energy utilities cost of capital, which is, you know, where they're talking about investment risk. No other environmental nonprofit is in there. You know, it's a money case. But we're in there because they're specifically saying, oh, there's all this new clean energy policy risk, and that means we need more money. No, you don't. Clean energy investments are inherently less risky. And so we were, you know, we're in that case fighting the good fight, saying, no, you actually don't need these new requests. In terms of the places that we engage to try and be a part of the conversation, you know, I would say about 2/3 of my life is regulatory, whether it's at the Energy Commission, the ISO. I do a lot on wholesale markets also, at the Energy Commission on their policy forecast. I do a lot at the legislature as well. We have a full-time person in Sacramento just doing legislative work. We also have consultants helping us on legislative issues. You know, we often sponsor bills on issues, or we'll sign on to bills in support. When you sponsor a bill in legislation, I'm certain you all know this, but you're actually like helping the author's office conceive of the concept. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that some of the things I talked about in this talk, we might be sponsoring legislation on to try and figure out kind of what's next. We also spend a lot of time engaging with industries themselves. You know, I talk with the gas companies all the time. I talk with PG&E all the time. You know, all these companies all the time, and really trying to understand what's their business model. So that way, you know, in PG&E's perspective, I talk about it as being the water balloon. You squeeze down part of the gas system, you expand part of the electric system, and you know, their shareholders should be indifferent. It's a very different story for SoCal Gas and Southern California Edison. So how do you handle that? So, you know, I spend a lot of time talking with them to try and figure out, here's what I want to accomplish from an environmental objective. How do we get your business model incentives to line up with that? All right, I think we've reached the end of the hour. Thank you all so much for being so kind and giving me some of your time.
You could probably put all the major environmental NGOs on like an axis that's the like practicality versus dyed in the wall.
And sometimes it's really great having here.
So my fiance works for Eric Love. So we have these.
You understand
the exact same thing.
Who's your
Kathleen Garcia.
Oh,
she works for Sacramento. The classes, you kind of need the pressure on all sides. You know, it's gotta be sort of without that down.
Yes, and I'm also following Sierra Club NRDC charges like once a week. There's like two it's like sometimes I know that okay, you guys can do this, we'll do this, we'll get
But yeah, the way my mind works, I'm always looking at it, reduce, yes, that. Yeah, so we often will take the same issue and disagree with each other, like most of the time, about what to do about it. That's fun.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, every now and then, like, I'm certain I crossed a line or two with that Sierra Club discussion, and then we yell at each other, and then we kind of
And then you realize remember who the real enemy is.
well, and then it's the same thing with the other side of it. Just asking, like, what we're all trying to change it.
Yeah.
Now, I have a lot of respect for each of these organizations. We all just have a different
Lunch is right next to the